The dust had not yet settled on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, when the stagecoach rattled to a stop, and a woman stepped down with nothing but a worn leather satchel, a heart full of grief, and the particular kind of stubborn courage that only comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. Her name was Eliza Grayson, and she was 26 years old in the autumn of 1878, which meant she had lived long enough to know that the world was rarely kind, and young enough to still believe it might try harder. She wore a gray wool traveling dress that had seen better days, her dark brown hair pinned beneath a sun-faded bonnet, and her green eyes moved across the dusty town of Caldwell with the careful assessment of someone who had learned not to trust a place before she had studied it properly. She had come from Cincinnati, Ohio, where she had buried her mother in the spring and her father's business in the summer, and where a man named Gerald Whitmore had taken every cent her father had left behind by means of a contract her father had signed in weaker days, leaving Eliza with the choice between destitution in a city that had already shown her its teeth, or something entirely unknown. She had chosen unknown. Her second cousin, a woman named Margaret Holt, had written to her the previous winter about a position teaching school in Caldwell, a cattle town on the southern edge of Kansas that sat right at the edge of the Kishom Trail. Margaret had said the town was rough but growing, that decent people were trying to make something of it, and that a school teacher with real credentials from back east would be welcomed. What Margaret had not mentioned in her letter, or perhaps had not known, was that Margaret herself had since moved on to Wichita following her husband's new employment with the railroad, leaving Eliza to arrive in a town where she knew precisely nobody. The stagecoach driver, a broad-shouldered man with a gray beard that reached his collarbone, handed down her single trunk from the top of the coach and gave her a look that was not unkind. "You got somebody meeting you, miss?" he asked. "I will find my way," Eliza told him, because that was what she always said, and because most of the time she had managed to make it true. The town of Caldwell in 1878 was a place balanced on a knife's edge between civilization and wildness. The cattle drives up from Texas filled the saloons every summer with drovers who spent their season's pay in a matter of days, and the merchants and settlers who had come to build something permanent lived in constant negotiation with that chaos. There were frame buildings going up alongside older structures that were little more than rough-hewn lumber and optimism. The marshal's office stood near the center of town, and a church with a new white steeple rose at the far end of the main street, as if trying to remind everyone of their better intentions. There was dust on everything, the smell of horses and cattle and cookfire smoke, and the wide Kansas sky above it all, so enormous that it made a person feel both small and strangely free. Eliza stood on the boardwalk with her trunk at her feet and her satchel over her shoulder and took all of it in. She was tired from 3 days of stagecoach travel. She was hungry. She was, though she would not have admitted it to a living soul, frightened. But she lifted her chin and walked toward the nearest building that had a sign she could read, which turned out to be a general store owned by a man named Harold Finch, who was round and friendly, and who told her that the schoolhouse position was indeed still open, that the school board had been trying to fill it since September, and that Mrs. Clara Dunmore, who ran a boarding house 2 streets over, had a room available. He also told her, while measuring out some lengths of calico for another customer, that she ought to be careful at the south end of town after dark, and that the best man in Caldwell to know if she ever needed anything was Oliver Atkins, who ran the Atkins cattle operation about 4 miles east of town, and who everybody seemed to trust. Eliza filed the name away without particular interest. She had not come to Caldwell to know men. She had come to earn a wage and build a quiet, independent life, which was about all she felt she could manage after the wreckage of the past year. She found Mrs. Dunmore's boarding house, took the small but clean room on the 2nd floor with the window that looked out over a vegetable garden, ate a bowl of beef stew that was the finest thing she had tasted in months, and slept for 11 hours without dreaming. She began work at the schoolhouse the following Monday. The school board, consisting of 3 merchants and the local minister, a Reverend Thomas Webb, interviewed her on a Saturday morning in the back of the general store and hired her on the spot. Because Eliza had real teaching credentials from the Cincinnati Normal School and could demonstrate facility with arithmetic, reading, geography, and basic natural sciences. And because the children of Caldwell had not had a teacher for 6 weeks and were, by all accounts, driving their parents to distraction. The schoolhouse was a single room with 22 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, and Eliza threw herself into the work with the focused energy of someone who needs occupation the way a drowning person needs a rope. She organized the students by level, established a daily schedule, sent home a list of supplies she would require, and within 2 weeks had the schoolhouse running with a quiet efficiency that caused several parents to approach her after Sunday services to express their gratitude. It was at one of those Sunday services, on a crisp October morning with the cottonwood trees along the creek turning gold, that she first properly laid eyes on Oliver Atkins. She had noticed him the previous Sunday, of course, the way you notice a tall person in any gathering, but she had not paid him particular attention. This Sunday he was standing outside the church after the service, talking to the minister and 2 other men, and something about the way he was listening made her look twice. He was not the loudest man in the group, not the one doing most of the talking. He was lean and weathered in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair and steady brown eyes beneath the brim of a well-worn hat. He had the kind of face that was not precisely handsome in any conventional way, but was entirely honest, every line of it consistent with itself, the face of a man who said what he meant and meant what he said. He caught her looking and gave a simple, courteous nod, and Eliza looked away and walked with Mrs. Dunmore toward the boarding house, and that was that. Except it was not quite that, because on Tuesday morning one of her students, a 7-year-old girl named Annie Atkins with 2 braids and a very serious expression, presented her with a small jar of honey and said, "My uncle sent this because he heard you were teaching us now, and he said it was the neighborly thing." Eliza looked at the jar of honey. "Please tell your uncle that I thank him very much, Annie. He also said to tell you that if you ever need anything, the Atkins Ranch is 4 miles east on the Sumner County Road," Annie added, with the careful precision of someone who had memorized an instruction. Eliza taught Annie the proper way to form the letter Q, and did not think about Oliver Atkins any more than was entirely reasonable for the rest of the day. She thought about him somewhat more than that on the walk home. The weeks that followed were busy enough to crowd out most extraneous thought. Caldwell was a town with real social tensions beneath its surface cheerfulness, tensions she began to understand more fully as she listened and observed. The cattle trade that brought money into town also brought a lawlessness that the permanent settlers endured with varying degrees of patience. There was friction between the Texan drovers and the local merchants, friction between the settlers who were trying to farm and the ranchers who needed open range, and underlying all of it a deeper and more troubling injustice in the treatment of the Osage people whose land this had all been within living memory, who were now confined to a reservation across the border in Indian Territory. Sometimes traveling through Caldwell on business that brought them nothing but suspicion from townspeople who had no understanding of what had been taken from them. Eliza, who had grown up with a father who believed in education as the great equalizer and a mother who had read to her from abolitionist literature since she was old enough to sit still, noticed these things with an attention that not everyone appreciated. When she mentioned to the school board that she thought she ought to accept the 2 children of a Mexican cattle drover who had settled near town, there was a lengthy discussion. Eliza waited out the discussion with polite patience, and then made her case so clearly and so firmly that the board agreed, largely because none of them could find an argument they were fully comfortable defending aloud. She was walking home from a board meeting in early November, the first cold snap of the season making her wish she had worn a heavier coat, when she came around the corner of the hardware store and nearly walked directly into Oliver Atkins. He caught her by the elbow to steady her, and then immediately released her and stepped back, removing his hat. "I beg your pardon, Miss Grayson. I did not see you coming." "Nor I you," she said, gathering herself. Up close he was taller than she had realized, and there was something in his expression, a kind of quiet attentiveness that she had not expected. "You know my name." "Annie talks about you every evening," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in what was not quite a smile but was on its way to becoming one. "According to my niece, you are the finest teacher in the whole territory." "Annie is a bright girl," Eliza said. "She has a particular gift for mathematics." "Her father had that," Oliver said, and something shifted in his expression briefly, the way a shadow moves across a field when a cloud passes. "Thank you for the care you take with her." "It is my work," Eliza said, "though she makes it very easy." There was a moment of silence that was not precisely uncomfortable but had weight to it. The cold wind moved down the street and Eliza pulled her coat tighter. "I noticed you walked to the board meeting," Oliver said. "It is a cold evening. If you will allow me, I can see you back to Mrs. Dunmore's." She wanted to say that she was perfectly capable of walking 2 streets in the dark. She was. But the wind had a serious edge to it and she was cold, and there was something about the offer that was so straightforwardly decent, with no performance in it at all, that she found herself saying, "Thank you, Mr. Atkins. That would be kind." They walked the 2 streets to the boarding house at a careful, proper distance from each other, and he asked her about Cincinnati, and she told him a little, not the grief and the losses but the city itself, the river and the hills and the newspapers. He listened the way she had noticed he listened in the churchyard, with his full attention. She asked him how long he had ranched in Kansas, and he told her he had come out from Missouri in 1869, when he was 22, with his older brother Daniel and Daniel's wife, and that they had built the operation together over nearly a decade. "Daniel passed away 2 years ago," he said, in a matter-of-fact way that did not ask for sympathy but contained a great deal of it. "Fever. I have been helping raise Annie since. She lives with me and my housekeeper, Mrs. Pina, at the ranch." "And Annie's mother?" Eliza asked gently. "She went back east to her family the following spring," he said. "She was not made for this life. I do not blame her. Annie chose to stay." He said this without judgment, and Eliza thought that told her something important about the man, that he could speak of a painful circumstance without bitterness or editorializing. They reached the boarding house and he held the gate of the small front fence open for her and touched the brim of his hat. "Good evening, Miss Grayson. I hope the board gave you what you needed." "Most of it," she said, and smiled before she could decide whether to or not. He smiled back, a real one this time, and it transformed his face in a way that surprised her, made it younger and warmer and considerably more dangerous to her composure. "Good night," he said, and walked back toward the livery stable where he had presumably left his horse. And Eliza went inside and stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand still on the door, not entirely sure what she was thinking. November moved through Caldwell with cold winds and the last of the cattle season, the trail drivers heading south again until spring, the town settling into its winter self, which was quieter and more neighborly. Eliza saw Oliver Atkins at church every Sunday and sometimes on the street in town, and they always stopped to speak for a few minutes. He was always courteous, always attentive, always entirely proper. He sometimes brought Annie into town on Saturday mornings, and when he did, Eliza would find herself watching the way he was with his niece, patient and warm and occasionally very funny in a dry, understated way that made Annie roll her eyes with the particular tolerant affection of a child who knows she is deeply loved. There came a Saturday in late November when a wheel on the supply wagon belonging to Mrs. Dunmore's boarding house broke on the road back from the mill, leaving Mrs. Dunmore and Eliza stranded about a mile from town with a load of winter flour. Eliza had already resigned herself to walking back to town for help when Oliver Atkins appeared on the Sumner County road with his ranch hand, a young man named Carlos Reyes who was 19 and unabashedly cheerful. They had the wagon repaired within an hour, Oliver having brought tools because Eliza was beginning to understand, the kind of man who brought tools. Afterward, Mrs. Dunmore invited them both to dinner, and Oliver, after a pause, accepted. It was the first time Eliza had been in his company for more than a few minutes, and it was over a simple dinner of roasted chicken and apple pie that she began to understand the shape of him more completely. He spoke about the ranch with a quiet pride that was not boasting, talked about the politics of the cattle market, and the railroad with an intelligence that was clearly well-informed, argued gently with Mrs. Dunmore about the town council's plans for a new water system in a way that was completely good-humored, and listened to Eliza describe the play her students were rehearsing for Christmas with the same seriousness he gave to everything else. He helped wash the dishes because Mrs. Dunmore's only housemaid had gone home sick, and he did it without being asked and without making any particular production of it. When he and Carlos had gone, Mrs. Dunmore, who was 60 and had no patience for what she called backing around the house to get to the front door, looked at Eliza over her cup of tea and said, "Oliver Atkins is a good man." "I am sure he is," Eliza said, with great care. "I have known him since he first came to this county," Mrs. Dunmore continued. "People have tried to match him up with half the eligible women between here and Wichita. He is always gracious and always finds a reason it will not work. I have wondered sometimes if he plans to spend his whole life alone." Eliza studied the surface of her tea. "Perhaps he prefers it." "Perhaps," Mrs. Dunmore said, in a tone that suggested she did not particularly believe that. December arrived with its cold beauty, the plains turning silver with frost in the mornings, the sky that particular shade of pale blue that comes only in winter. The Christmas play that Eliza's students performed in the church was, by all accounts, the finest entertainment Caldwell had seen since the 4th of July, and Eliza stood in the back afterward and felt, for the first time in many months, the particular lightness of genuine happiness. Oliver found her there after the performance while the other parents were crowding around their children, and he said, "Annie had every line memorized by the 3rd of December. She would practice them at breakfast." He paused. "You did a remarkable thing with those children." "They did a remarkable thing," she said. "I only organized it." "That is what good teaching is," he said. He was standing close enough that she could see the detail of his face clearly in the candlelight from the church windows, and something in his expression was different tonight, more open, less carefully composed. "You look very well tonight, Miss Grayson." It was such a simple thing to say, said so plainly, that it landed differently than a practiced compliment would have. Eliza felt color rise in her face and was grateful for the dim light. "Thank you, Mr. Atkins," she managed. Annie appeared then, flushed with triumph, and Oliver lifted her up and said something in her ear that made her laugh, and the moment passed, but Eliza carried it home with her in the cold December night and held it carefully in her thoughts for longer than was strictly sensible. January in Caldwell was cold in the way that the Kansas plains do winter, with a directness that leaves no room for argument. The temperature dropped hard and stayed down, and Eliza taught school in a building where the iron stove worked its hardest every day, and she graded papers by lamplight in her room at Mrs. Dunmore's, and she wrote letters to old friends in Cincinnati that were cheerful and not quite honest about how thoroughly she had come to feel at home here, in this rough and vital little place. She was careful about Oliver Atkins. She was careful in the particular way of someone who has decided very firmly not to want something and keeps noticing that they want it. She was careful not to look for him at church before he arrived, not to feel disproportionate pleasure when he appeared on the same street she was walking, not to replay their conversations in more detail than was warranted. She was largely unsuccessful in all of these efforts, but she was very careful. It was a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week of January, during a cold that had the whole town huddled close to its fires, that everything changed somewhat. She had stayed late at the schoolhouse to repair some of the books whose bindings had split, working by the light of 2 lanterns with a pot of paste in careful hands, and by the time she had finished and banked the stove and stepped outside, the town had gone very dark and the cold hit her like something physical. She was walking quickly, her breath clouding in the air, when she became aware of raised voices from the alley beside the saloon. She would have kept walking, because she was a sensible woman and alleys beside saloons at night were not places for sensible women, except that she recognized one of the voices as belonging to Carlos Reyes, Oliver's ranch hand. She stopped at the mouth of the alley. There were 3 men she did not recognize surrounding Carlos, men who had the look of drovers who had stayed past the season, and the conversation was ugly in the way that involved considerable contempt for the fact of Carlos's Mexican heritage, the kind of ugliness that Eliza had seen before, and that made something in her go very still and very clear. Carlos was standing his ground, but he was alone and outnumbered. Eliza did something that she later admitted to herself was not entirely wise, which was to step into the mouth of the alley and say, in her best schoolteacher voice, which was considerably more authoritative than her regular voice, "The marshal's office is on the next street, gentlemen. I am going to give you until the count of 10 to choose a different evening's entertainment." It was probably not the voice alone. It was probably also the fact that when one of the men grabbed for her, she stepped aside with the quick decisiveness she had not known she possessed, and that someone behind her said, "I would think very carefully about what you are about to do." And that voice was Oliver Atkins, who had come around the far end of the alley from wherever he had been, and was standing very still with the particular quality of stillness that the men in the alley clearly understood. It resolved without serious violence. The 3 men went, making sounds of departing dignity that fooled nobody. Carlos leaned against the wall and let out a long breath. Oliver looked at Eliza with an expression she could not immediately name. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Perfectly," she said, which was mostly true. Her hands were not entirely steady. "You walked into an alley after 3 men," he said. "I heard Carlos's voice," she said, as if this were a complete explanation. He looked at her for a long moment in the cold dark. Then he said, "Carlos, go find the marshal and describe those 3. Miss Grayson, I am walking you home." Carlos went. Oliver walked beside Eliza through the cold streets, and this time she did not think about the propriety of the distance between them because she was thinking about the way he had appeared at the far end of that alley, the way he had said those 6 words with such absolute quietness. "Where did you come from?" she asked. "I was at the livery. I heard the noise." He paused. "You cannot do things like that." "Someone was going to do something," she said, "and I was there. You could have been hurt." "So could Carlos," she said, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You are right, but you could have been hurt, and I—" He stopped. They were at the boarding-house gate. He held it open. The cold was absolute around them, and the stars above the Kansas plains were very bright and very far away. "You what?" she asked. He met her eyes in the darkness. "I would not like for you to be hurt, Miss Grayson," he said very quietly. "I would not like that at all." Something in the words, in the careful plainness of them, sat between them in the cold air, and Eliza felt something shift inside her chest, something that she had been holding very still for months. She said, "Good night, Mr. Atkins," and went inside and stood again in the hallway with her hand on the door. Only this time she knew exactly what she was thinking. She was thinking that she was in considerable trouble. February brought snow that settled over the plains in long white silence, and the town of Caldwell turned quiet and domestic, people visiting each other's homes more, the social season being indoors and intimate in the way that cold weather compels. Mrs. Dunmore hosted a small dinner twice a month for neighbors, and it was at one of these in early February that Oliver appeared, invited by Mrs. Dunmore with the cheerful transparency of a woman who has decided to be helpful. He sat across the table from Eliza, and they talked more that evening than they had in all their previous conversations combined. because the snow outside made time feel slower, more generous, and because Mrs. Dunmore and her two other guests, Reverend Webb and his wife, were excellent at the particular social art of creating conversation and then stepping back from it. Oliver told her about Missouri, about his childhood on his family's farm, his mother who had taught all her children to read before they ever saw a schoolhouse, his decision to come west with Daniel when he was 22 because the land in Missouri was already divided and spoken for, and he wanted to build something. "Were you not frightened?" she asked. "Coming into completely unknown country." "Profoundly," he said and smiled. "But I think the things worth building usually require some fright on the front end." She told him about Cincinnati more honestly than she had before, about her father's illness and the way the business had failed, about Gerald Whitmore and the contract, and about choosing to come west because it was the only honest choice she could make. She said it plainly and without self-pity because that was how she had made peace with it, and he listened with the whole of his attention. "That took real courage," he said. "It took real necessity," she said. "Courage is when you have options." "You had the option to go to a relative's house and be dependent," he said. "Most women in your position would have taken it without shame. You chose something harder and something yours. That is courage." She looked at him across Mrs. Dunmore's candle-lit table, with the snow falling outside the frosted windows, and felt the truth of the past several months arrive in her chest all at once, simply and completely. She was in love with Oliver Atkins. She had probably been working in that direction since the jar of honey in November, and possibly since before that, since the Sunday morning when she had watched him listen in the churchyard. It was not a dramatic revelation. It arrived quietly, the way the most important things do, like the sun coming over the flat Kansas horizon, not sudden but inevitable. She was also deeply uncertain what to do about it, because she had come to Caldwell to build an independent life, and because she had been hurt before in smaller ways, and because Oliver Atkins, for all his warmth and attention, had given her no explicit indication that his feelings were anything beyond friendly. Which was not quite true, but she was being careful. Spring came to the plains in March with a rush of green that was remarkable to her eastern eyes, the grasslands turning emerald almost overnight, the cottonwoods along the creek budding into pale green, the sky filling with the sounds of returning birds. Eliza's students began slipping into a springtime restlessness that she managed with outdoor arithmetic lessons and nature observation walks, which served the dual purpose of engaging the children and allowing her to show them the world beyond the schoolhouse walls. Oliver began making reasons to be in town on weekday afternoons, which he had not done during the winter. He always had legitimate business, a visit to the hardware, a meeting with a cattle buyer, a conversation with the marshal about the fence line dispute that was simmering between two neighboring ranchers. But he was there with a frequency that Eliza, who was honest with herself about most things, recognized as deliberate. He began bringing her things, not elaborate gifts, nothing that would have been improper but small and thoughtful things. A bundle of wild plums from the creek bank because she had mentioned she liked them. A newspaper from Wichita because it had an article about the Eastern educational reform movement she was interested in. A small pot of Mrs. Pina's chili sauce because Eliza had admired it at a church supper. Each thing was simple. Each thing required him to have been paying very close attention to what she said. April arrived, and with it, a complication in the form of a man named Harlan Pierce, who came to Caldwell as the new agent for a Kansas City land investment company, and who was handsome in a polished way, and who attached himself to Eliza with the confident ease of a man who has rarely been refused. He called on her at the boarding house, brought her flowers from the general store, and had a pleasant manner that Mrs. Dunmore found charming and that Eliza found on careful examination to be a manner rather than a personality. Oliver saw her walking with Harlan Pierce along the main street one Saturday afternoon, and Eliza, watching from a distance, saw something move across Oliver's face before it settled back into its customary steadiness. It was brief and it was real, and she felt it in the center of her chest. She declined Harlan Pierce's next 2 invitations on the grounds of school preparations, which was true but not entirely the reason. Harlan was not a bad man. He was simply not the man she was thinking about when she ought to have been thinking about other things. It was a Saturday morning in late April, the air smelling of new grass and something flowering along the creek, when Oliver appeared at the schoolhouse, which Eliza had stayed to organize for the following week, and knocked on the open door. She was sorting books on the far shelf and turned to find him standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which was unusual. He was always at ease, Oliver Atkins. Seeing him not quite at ease made something flutter in her throat. "I wondered if you might want to ride out to the creek," he said. "Annie has been asking if you might like to see the wildflowers. She found a patch of something she cannot identify, and she is convinced it is rare." "Is it a valid botanical concern?" Eliza said carefully. "Or is Annie acting as an intermediary for another reason?" The corner of his mouth moved. "I believe Annie genuinely wants you to identify the flower, but I will admit that I asked her if she might mention it." Eliza set down the book she was holding. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. They rode out to the creek, the 3 of them, Annie on her small gray pony and Oliver and Eliza on either side, through the April morning with the sky enormous and blue above them. Annie's flower was a blue-eyed grass, not rare but very pretty, growing in a wide patch along the bank where the cottonwoods dipped their new branches toward the water, and Eliza identified it and drew it in Annie's little nature notebook and showed her how the petals were arranged. Annie wrote the Latin name with the fierce concentration of a child storing important information, and then was distracted by a red-winged blackbird and ran after it, as children do, leaving Oliver and Eliza standing at the edge of the creek. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. The cottonwood fluff had not yet begun to fly, but the trees were fully leafed, their coin-shaped leaves flickering in the light breeze. It was, Eliza thought, about as beautiful as anything she had seen. Oliver was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "For what?" "For taking a very long time to say something I should have said months ago." He was looking at the creek, not at her, and this too was unusual, because Oliver Atkins generally looked directly at the people he was speaking to. "I have been sorting through the proper way to say it, and I have concluded that there is no proper way, that I simply have to say it and accept whatever comes of it." Eliza waited, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. He turned and looked at her then, and his brown eyes were completely open in a way she had not quite seen before, without the careful steadiness that was his habitual expression, simply honest and a little afraid. "I think about you a great deal," he said. "I think I have been thinking about you since that first Sunday morning in October, when you walked past the church and looked at the town as if you were deciding whether to trust it. I think I have been looking for reasons to be in town for months. I think the jar of honey was not really about being neighborly." Eliza felt the words settle into her, one by one, like stones finding their place. "I am not a man who says things I do not mean," he continued. "So I want you to know that I mean this exactly. I would like to come calling on you properly if you would allow it. I would like to get to know you even better than I already do, which I believe will take considerable time given that you are not a simple person. And I would like you to know that whatever you decide, my respect and friendship are not conditional on it." Eliza looked at him standing there at the edge of the spring creek, the light moving across his face, honest and steady and a little afraid, and she thought of Cincinnati and Gerald Whitmore and her mother's quiet house in the last winter, and the long stagecoach road to Caldwell, and the jar of honey and the alley in January, and every conversation they had had, every book he had noticed her reading, every time he had listened with his whole self. "I would like that," she said. "Very much." Something in his face changed completely, the way a landscape changes when the sun comes out from behind a cloud. He let out a breath and then, very carefully, allowed himself a full smile, which was the most spectacular thing she had seen in quite some time. "All right," he said, as if making a solemn contract. Annie ran back then with a clutch of wildflowers and no red-winged blackbird, and Oliver looked at his niece and then at Eliza and said quietly, "She will be insufferably pleased with herself." "She has good taste," Eliza said, which made him laugh, which was even better than the smile. The weeks that followed had the particular quality of a story gathering itself toward something. Oliver came calling on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, sitting in Mrs. Dunmore's front parlor while Mrs. Dunmore occupied herself with great ostentation in the adjacent room, and they talked about everything. He told her about the ranch in detail, about the work of cattle breeding and the economics of the trail drives, about his opinions on the homestead question, and the challenges facing the smaller ranchers as the railroad changed everything, about books he had read and things he had seen on the open range, storms and stars, and the particular silence of the plains in winter. She told him about her schoolchildren, about the ideas she had for expanding the curriculum, about her belief that education was the most important work anyone could do in a young country, about her childhood reading and her mother's garden and the river at Cincinnati in spring. They disagreed sometimes, which she had known they would, and which she liked. He thought the cattle trade would remain the economic engine of Kansas for decades. She thought the farmers would ultimately prevail. He thought the town marshal was doing adequate work on the lawlessness problem. She thought the structural conditions that created the lawlessness needed addressing, not just its individual expressions. They argued these things with complete mutual respect and considerable enjoyment, and Eliza thought that the ability to disagree with a person and feel closer to them afterward was probably one of the more reliable measures of something worth having. He was also funny in that quiet, dry way that she had first noticed with Annie, and she found that she was funnier in his company than she generally was elsewhere, which she took as significant evidence. On a Sunday afternoon in late May, he took her riding on the ranch, properly supervised by the very cheerful presence of Carlos and his interest in the wildflowers along the fence lines, and showed her the country he had built his life in. The ranch was beautiful in a way that surprised her, not the manicured beauty of eastern estates but something larger and more honest, the grasslands rolling toward the horizon, the cattle moving in the distance, the low ranch house with its porch and kitchen garden, the practical beauty of things built to last. He showed her the horses he was breeding, a project he clearly loved, talking about their lines and temperaments with a quiet expertise that she found she could listen to indefinitely. He introduced her to Mrs. Pina, who was a compact, warm woman in her 50s from a ranching family in New Mexico, who had looked after the Atkins household for 6 years and who shook Eliza's hand and looked at her with a very direct assessment, and then smiled, which Eliza took as a good sign. They stood on the porch of the ranch house in the late afternoon, looking out over the grasslands toward the western horizon where the sun was beginning its long descent, and Oliver said, "I love this place. I have loved it since the first summer. Daniel and I used to stand right here at the end of the day and think we were the luckiest men alive." "I can understand why," she said. "I want to make it better," he said. "I have plans for the south pasture, for a proper irrigation system, for a bigger barn. I think this place could be something remarkable in 20 years. She heard in this what she thought he meant, and turned to look at him and found him already looking at her. "You could build a good life here," she said, not quite a question. "I think so," he said. "I have been waiting to be certain of all the pieces." It was June when he kissed her, on a Tuesday evening in Mrs. Dunmore's garden, where they had gone to look at the roses that were just beginning to bloom. They had been standing close together, examining a particular red rose that Mrs. Dunmore claimed was descended from a cutting she had brought all the way from Illinois, and when Eliza had straightened up, she had found him closer than she expected, his eyes on her with that complete openness she had come to love. He had asked with his eyes before his words, and she had answered with hers, and he had kissed her with such careful tenderness that she felt it all the way to her fingertips. And when they stepped apart, she had the impression that the world had rearranged itself into a configuration that made considerably more sense than the one she had been living in. Mrs. Dunmore, who appeared on the porch of the boarding house approximately 90 seconds later with what she described as a lamp she had been meaning to bring outside, was not particularly convincing as a casual presence, but Eliza was too happy to hold it against her. July arrived with its cattle season heat and the return of the trail drovers to Caldwell, and with it a problem that Oliver had to give his full attention to. A group of drovers had been cutting through his south fence line, damaging his pasture and creating a dispute with a neighboring rancher who suspected Oliver's cattle of wandering. Oliver spent 2 weeks riding fences and having difficult conversations and attending a mediation at the marshal's office. And during those 2 weeks, he came to town less often, and Eliza taught school and read and helped Mrs. Dunmore put up preserves and held the feeling of June in Mrs. Dunmore's garden carefully in her chest, and did not spend more than an appropriate amount of time wondering when she would see him again. She saw him on a Sunday when he came to church looking tired and dusty and considerably more worn than usual, and he sat in the pew and listened to Reverend Webb, and she sat 3 rows away and occasionally, when she was certain no one was watching, allowed herself to look at the side of his face, the familiar line of it, the way he listened. After the service he found her in the churchyard and said, "I am sorry I have been scarce," and she said, "You have had real things to attend to," and he said, "You are one of the real things," in such a plain and entirely sincere way that she had to look at the churchyard grass for a moment to compose herself. The fence dispute resolved, as Oliver had said it would, in his favor, and the drovers' company paid for the damage, and the summer settled back into its hot rhythm. In August, Oliver asked if she would ride with him on a Sunday afternoon out to a particular place on the ridge above the creek, and they rode out together with the full permission of a Sunday's leisure and the permission of a courtship that had become, Eliza thought, something understood by both of them as serious. The ridge looked west over the grasslands, and in the late afternoon the light fell across the plains in long golden streams, and the grass moved in the wind like something breathing, and Oliver sat beside her on the ridge with their horses grazing nearby and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that I have thought about it very carefully and that my mind is entirely clear." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the horizon. "I want you to know that I am not asking because the season is right or because I am at a convenient age or because it seems like the thing a man ought to do," he said. "I am asking because I cannot imagine the next 40 years of my life without you in them, and because I think we would build something remarkable together, and because I have been waiting without knowing I was waiting since before I understood what I was waiting for." He paused and turned to look at her, directly, completely. "Will you marry me, Eliza Grayson?" She felt the question land in every part of her, the truth and the simplicity and the weight of it, and she thought of everything she had come from and everything she had come to, the stagecoach and the dust and the schoolhouse and Mrs. Dunmore's garden and the jar of honey and the creek in April and every Tuesday and Thursday evening in the parlor, and the way he listened, and the way he laughed, and the way he had stood at the end of that dark alley in January with 6 quiet words that had already told her everything she needed to know. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." He took her hand, and they sat on the ridge above the creek in the long August light, and the grass moved around them, and the whole enormous Kansas sky held them in its blue immensity, and Eliza thought that there was, after all, something very right about the world. She did ask him later because she had wondered, and because she was the kind of woman who asked the things she wondered about. They were riding back toward town in the cooling evening, and she said, "Your Mrs. Dunmore told me months ago that people had been trying to marry you off for years. Why did you never marry?" Oliver was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking, which was one of the things she loved about him, that he took questions seriously and gave them real thought before answering. "Because you had not arrived yet," he said. It was so simple and so complete that she could not speak for a moment. He was not performing it, not constructing a pretty phrase. He was stating what he believed to be a plain fact, the same way he stated every plain fact, directly and without ornamentation. She reached across the space between their horses and took his hand for a moment, and he turned it and held hers, and they rode the rest of the way back to Caldwell in the warm August dark. And Eliza thought she would remember this ride, this particular light, these particular words, for the rest of her life. They were married on the 14th of October, 1879, in the church on the main street of Caldwell, which had acquired a second coat of white paint since Eliza had arrived a year before, and which was full to its capacity with the considerable proportion of the town that had come to witness what several people privately described as a conclusion they had seen coming since November. Reverend Webb performed the ceremony with evident satisfaction. Annie Atkins stood as the flower girl and took the role with a seriousness that made the congregation smile. Carlos Reyes, who had been invited as one of Oliver's witnesses, wore a new shirt that he had clearly purchased specifically for the occasion and looked very fine in it. Mrs. Pina wept quietly and happily in the third row. Eliza wore a dress that she and Mrs. Dunmore had made together from a length of deep blue silk that Mrs. Dunmore had kept in her trunk for a special occasion for 11 years, declaring that this qualified. She carried a small bunch of late-season wildflowers that Annie had collected along the creek the previous afternoon, including, Annie had pointed out with satisfaction, some blue-eyed grass that had made a second appearance in the fall. When Reverend Webb said the words and Eliza and Oliver spoke theirs in turn, Eliza thought about the 14 months since she had stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but a worn leather satchel, and the particular stubborn courage of having nothing left to lose. She thought she had lost enough, for long enough, to know what it was worth to have found this. Oliver held her hands and said his words and looked at her with those honest brown eyes, and she said hers and meant every syllable of every word, and Reverend Webb declared them married, and Oliver kissed her very properly while the church made a noise of collective approval, and Annie Atkins threw her flower petals with decisive accuracy. The reception was held in the cleared-out space behind the general store, which Harold Finch had allowed them to use, and which the women of the church auxiliary had decorated with autumn branches and lanterns. There was a fiddle player and a harmonica player and dancing that went on past the point of dignity and into the territory of genuine joy. Oliver danced badly and knew it and danced anyway, which endeared him to everyone present. Eliza danced well and taught him the pattern of a Virginia reel, and by the third time through he had it, because he was a man who paid attention and learned quickly. They spent their first night as a married couple at the ranch, which Mrs. Pina had decorated with flowers and left a supper in the kitchen, and then made herself absent with great tact to her own quarters. And Eliza walked through the ranch house that was now also her home and felt the reality of it settle around her, solid and right. Oliver stood in the doorway of the kitchen watching her, and she turned and looked at him, and he said, "Well, Mrs. Atkins," with the same quiet precision with which he said everything, and the name was so new and so true at once that she laughed, and he smiled, and that was the beginning of their life together. The first year of marriage had the texture of a life that was building itself under their hands. Eliza continued teaching, because the school board was not going to find another teacher easily, and because she loved the work, and because Oliver, who had a clear-eyed understanding of what made a person who they were, had never suggested she stop. She rode to school in the mornings on a bay mare that Oliver had selected for her with considerable care, a calm and reliable animal named Penny who had a sweet disposition and an excellent gait. She brought her ideas to the ranch the way she had brought them to the schoolhouse, not imposing but proposing, asking Oliver's opinion about things and offering hers when asked, and they made decisions together with the same pleasure they had found in their Tuesday and Thursday evening arguments in Mrs. Dunmore's parlor. She helped plan the South Pasture irrigation project because she had a facility for the geometry of it, and because Oliver had built up a picture of what he wanted, and she could see how the pieces fit. They argued about 3 different approaches and combined elements of all of them, and arrived at something better than either had started with. Carlos Reyes, who had been quietly trying to learn to read beyond the basic level he had been taught as a child, appeared at the ranch one Sunday morning and confessed this ambition to Eliza with the careful courage of someone who is not sure of his reception. Eliza sat him down at the kitchen table and they spent 2 hours going through a reader, and when he left, Oliver, who had been in the adjacent room pointedly mending a bridle, came to the kitchen door and said, "You know he will take all his evenings now." "Good," she said. "He has a good mind and he deserves to use it." Oliver looked at her with an expression she recognized by now, the particular warm steadiness that was how he looked at her when she did something that confirmed something he already knew. "Yes, he does," he said. Annie came to live at the ranch full-time in the spring, her mother having written to Oliver to confirm that Annie's wish to stay in Kansas was consistent with her own life in Philadelphia, and the 3 of them settled into a family life that had the practicality and warmth of people who have genuinely chosen each other. Annie regarded Eliza with an esteem that was enormously gratifying and occasionally slightly daunting, because Annie had very high standards and she expressed them frankly, which was something she had apparently come by honestly. In the spring of 1881, Eliza told Oliver she was expecting a child, and his response was to be very still for a moment, and then to look at her with an expression that she could not have described in words, but that she understood completely. That combination of joy and gravity and wonder that is the particular territory of things that matter very much. Their son was born in December of 1881, delivered by Mrs. Pina, and the town doctor with the competent efficiency that attends uncomplicated births, a large healthy boy with dark hair and Oliver's brown eyes, whom they named Daniel James Atkins for his uncle and for Eliza's father. Oliver held his son in the lamplight of the bedroom and was very quiet for a long time, and Eliza, tired and entirely happy, watched his face and did not say anything because some things are sufficient in themselves without words. Annie, who was 11 now and completely authoritative on all subjects, declared that Daniel was the finest baby she had ever encountered, and appointed herself his primary educator on the grounds that someone had to start early, a position that Eliza endorsed with only slight modifications. The town of Caldwell was changing around them. The railroad had come through, which changed the economics of the cattle trade and the character of the town both. There were more permanent settlers, more farms being broken on the grasslands, and with that came the ongoing friction between farmers who wanted to fence and ranchers who needed open range, and Oliver spent considerable time in meetings trying to negotiate arrangements that both groups could live with. He was good at this. Eliza had found the patient, honest brokering that comes from genuinely respecting the validity of more than one position. The injustices of the frontier were not invisible to Eliza or Oliver. The displacement that had been done to the native peoples of the region was not something either of them could look at without recognition, and when 2 Osage men came through Caldwell on business in the spring of 1882 and were refused service at the main restaurant, and then challenged by a group of men on the street, Oliver was the person who stepped between them and the men, and who saw the Osage visitors safely on their way. And Eliza taught her school children about the history of the land they lived on with an honesty that caused one school board member to complain, and that she defended at the next board meeting so thoroughly that the complaint was not repeated. These were not small things, but they were the things that made a life, and Eliza had understood since Cincinnati that building something required doing the real work, not the comfortable version of it. In 1883, she had her second pregnancy, and this one gave her more difficulty in the middle months but resolved into another healthy birth, a girl they named Margaret Elaine Atkins, for Eliza's second cousin who had written the letter about the teaching position, without whom none of this would have been, and for Oliver's mother. Maggie, as she was immediately called by Annie, had her mother's green eyes and her father's steadiness, and had opinions about everything from approximately the age of 8 months. Carlos Reyes, who had been reading everything Oliver's small library could provide for 2 years by this point, announced in the summer of 1883 that he was going to take the entrance examination for the new agricultural college in Manhattan, Kansas, and that he thought he was ready. Oliver drove him to the examination himself, and Carlos passed with a score that the examiner called impressive, and the ranch celebrated this with a dinner that Mrs. Pina cooked in the manner of a festival. Eliza taught school until the end of the 1884 school year, when she informed the school board that she was stepping back from the full-time position to spend more time with her growing family, though she would remain available to assist the new teacher and to teach adult reading classes 2 evenings a week, which she had been running for 3 years by then, and which she had no intention of stopping. The school board, which had by this point found in her 10 years, as of her retirement, the finest teacher who had served the town, received this announcement with genuine sadness, and presented her with a leather-bound journal with her name stamped in gold on the cover, signed by every student and parent who could be reached, which was most of them. Oliver found her that evening sitting on the porch reading through the signatures in the journal, her 2 children asleep inside, the summer night warm and full of cricket sound, and he sat beside her and read over her shoulder without speaking for a while, and then he put his arm around her and she leaned into him and they sat in the Kansas night while the stars came out over the grasslands and the cicadas sang their enormous noise. "You changed a great many lives," he said. "People change their own lives," she said. "I just gave them some tools." "That is the 3rd time you have said something like that," he said. "The first was about your students and the Christmas play. The second was about the irrigation project. You have a habit of giving yourself insufficient credit." She smiled against his shoulder. "You have a habit of noticing things." "It is a very convenient habit when you are the thing I am noticing," he said. She lifted her head and looked at him in the warm dark, this man who had built a life on honesty and patience, and the particular courage of someone who knows what he wants and waits for the right thing rather than settling for the convenient one. And she thought about what he had said on that August ridge, and she was glad, as she was glad every day, that she had stepped off that stagecoach and into the dust of Caldwell. "I love you," she said, because she said it often and it was always true and it was always worth saying. "And I love you," he said, "Eliza Atkins," and kissed her temple, and they sat together on the porch while the Kansas night held its breath and then exhaled in a long warm breeze that moved through the cottonwoods along the creek and rustled the kitchen garden and passed on over the grasslands toward the endless horizon. By 1885, the ranch had become what Oliver had envisioned on that porch years before when he had told her about his plans, something substantial and well-built. The south pasture producing well under the new irrigation system, the horse breeding program producing animals that had a reputation for quality across the county, the herd well managed, and the land treated with the careful stewardship of someone who intends to pass it on. Oliver had also taken on a second ranch hand, a young man named Samuel Brooks who had come to Caldwell on a cattle drive from Texas and decided to stay, and the operation had the comfortable efficiency of a place where everyone knows their work and values it. Annie was 15 now, serious and brilliant, and going to argue anyone flat on the subject of education, a quality she said she had learned from Eliza, and that Eliza privately thought Annie had possessed since birth. Annie was reading everything she could get, the newspapers, the agricultural journals Oliver subscribed to, a collection of novels that Eliza had ordered by mail from a bookshop in Kansas City, and she had announced with the same declarative certainty she brought to everything that she intended to go to college. In 1879, when Eliza had arrived, the idea of a woman attending college was not impossible but was certainly aspirational. By 1885, it was becoming less theoretical, particularly for a young woman with Annie's capabilities, and Oliver, to his considerable credit, took the aspiration completely seriously. He and Eliza researched the options together and wrote letters to several institutions, and Annie worked on her preparatory examinations with an intensity that reminded Eliza of Carlos the summer before his entrance exam. Daniel, who was 4 and fascinated by horses to the exclusion of most other things, spent his days following Oliver and Samuel around the paddock with the focused devotion of a child who has found his subject. Maggie, who was nearly 2, was showing every sign of having inherited both her mother's opinions and her father's patience with other people's arguments, which Oliver said was an alarming combination, and Eliza said was exactly what the world needed. Mrs. Pina, who had been with the household since before Eliza arrived, and who was as much a part of its life as any of them, was teaching Maggie the names of the kitchen herbs in Spanish, which Maggie was absorbing with the linguistic ease of a very young child. Oliver had learned a considerable amount of Spanish himself over the years, partly from Mrs. Pina and partly from his many conversations with Carlos, and the ranch house had a comfortable bilingual quality in its daily conversation that Eliza found she had come to love. In the evenings, after the children were put to bed, Eliza and Oliver sat on the porch or in the front room and talked, the same way they had always talked, about everything and nothing, about the ranch and the school board and what Annie had read that week, and what was happening in Washington that was going to affect the cattle market, and what Eliza thought about the new novel she had received from the Kansas City bookshop, and what Oliver thought about the fencing laws that the state legislature was considering. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, reading near the same lamp, and Eliza thought there was nothing more luxurious in the world than silence with a person you love, the kind where nothing needs to be said because everything has already been understood. She thought sometimes about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in October of 1878 with a worn leather satchel and a heart full of grief and nothing left to lose. And she thought that woman would not quite recognize the life she was living, not because it had become something she could not have imagined, but because it had become something too particular and too good to have been possible to imagine in advance. She had imagined independence and quiet competence, and a life she had built with her own hands. She had not imagined Oliver Atkins at the end of a dark alley in January, or in Mrs. Dunmore's parlor on a cold February evening, or on a ridge above the creek in August, saying the simplest and most complete thing she had ever heard. She had not imagined Annie falling asleep over a book in the front room and needing to be steered to bed. She had not imagined Daniel's face when he first held the reins of his own small horse. She had not imagined Maggie solemnly repeating the Spanish word for cilantro to Mrs. Pina's immense satisfaction. She had not imagined the sense of having a place, not just a location but a place in the deepest sense, a place in a family and a community, and a landscape that had come to feel as necessary as breathing. September of 1886 brought the news that Annie had been accepted to the Kansas State Agricultural College in Manhattan, one of the few institutions that admitted women alongside men, offering her a full course of study. She told Oliver at dinner, and he was very still for a moment in that way he had, and then he looked at his niece with the complete openness he reserved for things that mattered very much and said, "Your father would have been proud," and Annie, who almost never cried, had to look at the ceiling for a moment. Eliza reached across the table and took Annie's hand. "You earned this," she said. "Everything you put into those books, every examination, every late night, you earned every word of that acceptance." "You taught me how to earn things," Annie said, which was the finest thing anyone had said to Eliza in quite some time. Oliver drove Annie to Manhattan in October, a 2-day journey, and came back quieter than usual for a few days. The silence of a man who has seen something he loves walk toward a horizon, and Eliza understood this without needing it explained, and made sure his coffee was hot, and his evenings were full of conversation, and that Daniel, who sensed his father's mood with the particular antennae of children, spent more than usual time in the paddock with him. By November, Oliver had settled back into himself, and they received their first letter from Annie, 6 pages long and dense with observations about her professors and the library and the other students and the college's agricultural research programs, and the household read it together around the dinner table 3 times. Life on the plains moved in seasons, and the seasons moved through Eliza and Oliver's life with the layered beauty of a place they had chosen and continued to choose. Carlos Reyes came back from the agricultural college in the summer of 1887 with a degree and a head full of new ideas about irrigation and crop rotation and the particular chemistry of Kansas soil, and he and Oliver spent an entire summer arguing productively about the South pasture, and the following spring's results proved Carlos correct on 2 points and Oliver correct on 1, and this was considered by both parties to be a satisfying outcome. Eliza's adult reading classes continued through all of it, 2 evenings a week in the schoolhouse, and the students who came to them over the years were a cross-section of everything Caldwell was: cowhands and wives of settlers, and a Mexican family who had come up from Texas, and a man named John Walks Far who was Osage, and who had come to Caldwell on trading business, and stayed because the land near the creek reminded him of something, and who became one of the most diligent and capable students Eliza had ever taught. He and Eliza had long conversations about the history of the land, conversations that he approached with a dignity and patience that she thought contained more generosity than she deserved, and that taught her things she had not understood before, and which she incorporated into what she taught the children of Caldwell in her evening sessions, and in the curriculum she continued to develop for the schoolhouse teachers who followed her. She wrote a curriculum guide for the Caldwell School in 1888, incorporating everything she had learned in 10 years of teaching on the frontier, including history that acknowledged what had happened to the peoples of the plains, with an honesty that the previous curriculum had not had. The school board approved it with the decisive majority she had come to rely on, having spent a decade building the understanding that honest history was not the enemy of civic pride, but its foundation. Daniel, 6 years old in 1887, had decided that his future lay in horses as firmly as a person can decide anything at 6, and Oliver began teaching him in earnest, the way you teach someone you expect to be serious about it, naming the parts of the harness and the principles of the gait and the languages of a horse's body. Daniel absorbed it with the complete attention his father gave to everything, which was either inherited or very thoroughly learned, and Eliza watched them together in the paddock in the late afternoon light and felt something that was so complete it barely had room for words. Maggie, at 5, had elected to be interested in everything, which was more exhausting and more delightful. She read before she started school, because she had watched Annie and then Daniel do their lessons for years, and had apparently decided that waiting for school was an unnecessary delay, and she was already the kind of reader who fell into books and had to be extracted from them for meals, a quality Oliver recognized with fond helplessness and Eliza recognized with complete sympathy. Annie came home for the summers and brought books and arguments and the particular energy of a young woman discovering what she is capable of, and the house in those summers was loud and full in a way that Eliza loved unreservedly. Annie had met a young man at the college, a farmer's son named William Hartley, who was studying agricultural science, and who was, by Annie's description, serious and kind, and considerably less irritating than most people, which in Annie's register translated to something very warm indeed. Oliver received this information with the careful equanimity of an uncle who loves his niece and is also completely protective of her, and Eliza spent several evenings talking him through the distinction between appropriate concern and excessive obstruction. William came to the ranch the following summer, a quiet young man with genuine intelligence and a transparent admiration for Annie that even Oliver found difficult to argue with. And by the end of that visit, Oliver had given his assessment to Eliza as, "He is steady and he means what he says," which she understood to be the highest praise. In the autumn of 1889, Eliza discovered she was expecting again, at 37, which she had not precisely anticipated, and which she and Oliver received with a shared gladness that was a different and deeper thing than the first time, not less joyful but more settled, like something added to something already full. The pregnancy moved through the winter without trouble, and in May of 1890 they had another son, whom they named George Oliver Atkins, and who arrived in the world with his grandmother Eliza's green eyes and the particular air of a person who has arrived and intends to stay. Oliver held George in the lamplight of the bedroom, the same lamplight, the same steady hands, and looked at Eliza with the same expression she had seen when Daniel was born, that combination of joy and gravity and wonder. Only this time she had the particular gift of knowing already that this was the expression he would keep, that it was as honest a piece of him as any other. "Hello, George," he said to his son, with the same quiet seriousness he brought to everything, as if he were introducing himself to someone he expected to know for a very long time. He was. Caldwell moved into its later years in the 1890s with the steady transformation of the cattle frontier. The great trail drives up the Kisham Trail had largely ended by the late 1880s, the railroad having made them unnecessary, and the town reinvented itself as the railroad and farming economy grew. Some of the roughness smoothed. The saloons remained, but the summer wildness of the drover season was a thing of the past. New families came, farmers and merchants and professionals, and the town grew in the direction of permanence. The Atkins ranch adapted with the times, as Oliver had always planned it should. The horse breeding program grew and became the operation's signature. Atkins horses developing a regional reputation for quality that brought buyers from as far as Colorado. Daniel, who was a young man of 16 in 1897, already had more knowledge of horses than most men twice his age, and Oliver began teaching him the business side as he had taught him the animal side, with the same patient thoroughness. Carlos Reyes had built a life in the county, working as an agricultural advisor to several ranching families, and farming a homestead claim he had taken up south of Caldwell, and he and his wife Maria, whom he had married in 1889, came to Sunday dinners at the Atkins Ranch with their 3 children often enough to be considered nearly family. Eliza and Maria had become close friends, united by a mutual directness and a shared view that the world needed considerably more honesty and considerably less polite evasion. Mrs. Pina retired from housekeeping in 1893 when her daughter in Santa Fe needed her, and there was a departure that felt like losing a family member. She had been part of the house for so long that her absence was a real presence for months, felt in the kitchen and in the evenings, and in the particular way she had of appearing with something warm to eat at exactly the moment you needed it. She wrote letters from Santa Fe, long and warm ones, and Eliza wrote back, and they maintained a friendship across the distance that was genuine and continuous. Annie graduated from the Agricultural College in 1890 with honors and married William Hartley in the autumn of that year, in a ceremony at the Caldwell Church that was considerably larger than Eliza and Oliver's had been because Annie had been in Caldwell long enough to have accumulated a great many friends, and William's family came from 3 counties over and filled the town to its capacity. Oliver walked Annie down the aisle and sat beside Eliza afterward and held her hand through the whole ceremony with the grip of a man who knows something is right and is also aware that it requires courage. Annie and William settled on a farm 20 miles east of Caldwell, and built the kind of life that two intelligent, hard-working, mutually respectful people build when they have been paying attention to good examples, which they both had. Their first child, a boy named Daniel after Annie's father, was born in 1892, and the Atkins household received this news with the particular joy of people adding to something they love. In the evenings of the late 1890s, Eliza and Oliver sat on the porch of the ranch house they had lived in together for nearly 20 years, and the house had the quality of a place that has been entirely inhabited, not merely occupied. The porch was where they had talked through every decision of consequence, where they had watched thunderstorms come in off the plains with the grand theater of plains weather, where Daniel had learned to sit still, and George, who was less interested in stillness, had learned to sit still for shorter periods. The kitchen garden had expanded over the years and contracted again, and was now precisely the size it needed to be. The cottonwood trees that had been saplings when Oliver and Daniel had first built were enormous now, giving shade that covered the whole east side of the house. Oliver's hair had gone gray at the temples sometime in his mid-40s, which Eliza found extremely distinguished and told him so, and he had said with the dry precision she loved, "You are biased." She was. She was entirely biased, and she considered this a point of pride. She had lines at the corners of her eyes, and her hair had a streak of white at the left temple, and she was 44 years old in the last year of the century, and she felt entirely herself in a way that she was not sure she could have predicted from the vantage of that stagecoach arriving in the dust of Caldwell in 1878. She had come to Caldwell with nothing left to lose, and had built something that she would not have traded for anything that existed. On the last evening of 1899, which they spent as they had spent most significant evenings, together on the porch with the children in various states of presence and absence, Daniel having gone to help a neighboring family with a difficult foaling and Maggie reading by the lamp inside and George asleep in the manner of 10-year-olds who have run themselves thoroughly into the ground, Eliza and Oliver sat with the end of the century around them, and the plains dark and enormous beyond the fence. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," she asked, "if that stagecoach had gone somewhere else, if Margaret had moved to Wichita before she wrote to me?" Oliver was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark. "I try not to think about that," he said, "because I would have gone on not knowing what I was missing, and that is a terrible thing to contemplate." She leaned against him in the cold evening, his arm around her, the familiar solid warmth of him. "I think about October of 1878 sometimes," she said, "standing on that boardwalk with everything I owned in a single trunk." "I know," he said. "I can see it when you think about it. Your face does something particular." "What does it do?" "It goes very still," he said, "and then something very like wonder." She smiled at the dark. This was it, she thought. This was the whole of what a life could be, built slowly and honestly, one choice at a time, by two people who had decided that the truth was worth the effort it required. Oliver Atkins, who had waited without knowing he was waiting. Eliza Grayson, who had arrived in the dust of a cattle town with nothing left to lose and had proceeded to gain everything. The new century was coming. The plains were dark and enormous and full of stars. The ranch house behind them held its sleeping children and its lived-in warmth, and outside the fence the grasslands ran to the horizon, and the same enormous Kansas sky that had been over her head since the morning of her arrival held its place above them, vast and indifferent in the best possible way, as if to say that the world was bigger than any of it, and that was exactly the point. Oliver pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and she heard in it everything he had always been, the patience and the honesty and the particular courage of a man who had said, simply because you had not arrived yet, and had meant it with his whole heart. She had arrived. She had stayed. She was home. And somewhere in the house behind her, her daughter was reading and her son was sleeping, and the new century was coming in over the horizon, and the story of Eliza and Oliver Atkins had not ended, was not ending, was simply continuing in all the beautiful and ordinary ways that the best stories do, one day and one season and one honest word at a time, for as long as the Kansas sky chose to hold them. Which, as any good Plains person will tell you, is a very long time indeed.